In his chapter titled Maternal Justice, Anthony Platt contends that female reformers played an instrumental role in the child-saving movement, particularly in large cities in the Midwest, such as Chicago. There was broad support for the idea that women should be involved in regulating the welfare of children. During the late 19th century and early 20th century, career options were very limited for females. Keep in mind that the 19th Amendment, which prohibited state or federal sex-based restrictions on voting, was not passed until 1920. So it stands to reason that females during this time period lacked opportunities. Females were, however, permitted to get involved in the child-saving movement and were even encouraged to do so. In fact, there was an assumption that women were more morally pure than men, and therefore they were better equipped to deal with matters which pertained to children. Platt argues that many of the child savers were women who were bored at home and unhappy with their lack of participation in the real world. Platt insinuates that women began to focus on the child-saving movement because it was not deemed to be threatening to males. In fact, Platt contends that the participation of the child savers in public affairs was justified as an extension of their housekeeping functions, so they were not regarded as competitors for jobs usually performed by men. The child savers were generally well-educated, widely traveled, and had access to political and financial resources. They also had ample leisure time to pursue philanthropic interests. Interestingly, many of the husbands of these women regarded their wives' interest in child welfare as just another new hobby. Platt argues that the child-saving movement was heavily influenced by middle-class women who extended their housewifely roles into public service. Had these women been allowed to work in other areas, such as the business arena, it is likely that they would have. However, because of limited opportunities, they worked toward creating a juvenile justice system. This was not deemed threatening to males. Again, remember, women did not even have a right to vote during this time. Most of the child savers believed that women had the right to vote, but they disagreed over the means of achieving equal rights. Many of the child savers, such as Jane Addams, also believed that children were forced into premature independence because they yielded labor power. Remember, during this time there was an industrial revolution in the United States as America began to move from manual manufacturing to machine production. And there were factory jobs available in the city. Many child savers were horrified that young children were working in these factories. They also did not like the fact that child workers would have disposable income to spend on commercialized vices such as comic books, alcohol, amusement parks, and even brothels. In short, they were cognizant of the fact that society was changing. America was becoming the world's leading industrial power, but they believed this was having an adverse effect on young people. They feared that children were being objectified by modern industrialization. Platt points out in his book that while the child savers were somewhat leery of modern industrialism, they always remained within the bounds of orthodox political action. In other words, they never directly challenged capitalism or big business. They never advocated for a redistribution of power. Again, it is important to remember that many of the child savers were married to prominent businessmen. The child-saving movement provided middle-class women with a way to be influential in the public realm. During this time, women were excluded from politics and the business world. However, the child-saving movement was a vehicle that they used in order to gain power and influence social policy. It opened up new career opportunities for women, and women had the chance to influence social policy. They managed to extend governmental control over a whole range of youthful activities that had previously been ignored or dealt with informally. In his book, Platt discusses how juvenile reformatories emerged during the mid-19th century. He focuses specifically on the state of Illinois and contends that reformatories during this time leased the labor of young boys. In many respects, these reformatories were miniature prisons, and a high percentage of the inmate population was committed for truancy. Children between the ages of 7 and 14 were compelled to attend school. Truant officers were actually authorized to arrest children of school-going age who skipped school. If you read the supplemental article titled "Saving the Children, the Promise and Practice of Parens Patria, 1838 to 98, you see that the author will argue that 19th century juveniles who were committed to reformatories for non-criminal acts were not treated very well, even though they hadn't broken a law. In this article, which is available on Blackboard, is actually very disturbing, as it shows that young children were often exploited and that the state was not a benevolent parent. You will definitely want to read this article as you cover the second half of Anthony Platt's book. It makes for very interesting reading, and it is important supplemental material which contributes to our understanding of Platt's work. The child savers were adamant that children should not be processed through the criminal courts or incarcerated with older offenders. They wanted a juvenile court to be created so that children could be saved from contamination of association with older criminals. Nevertheless, this never fully came to fruition. In fact, even today, there are some states which still incarcerate children with adult offenders, though this is rare. Eventually, the child savers' efforts culminated into the Juvenile Court Act of 1899. As a result of this law, children from lower class families were in some cases removed from their homes, which were deemed to be incompetent. Delinquents were also institutionalized in order to remove them from corrupting influences. Platt points out that juveniles from middle-class families were largely exempt from investigation and recrimination. With the creation of the juvenile court, juvenile delinquents also lost important due process rights. Underlying the Juvenile Court Act was the concept of parens patria, by which courts were authorized to use wide discretion in resolving the problems of children. If a juvenile was accused of a crime, proceedings tended to be informal, and due process safeguards were not applicable due to the court's civil jurisdiction. And Platt points out that the child savers penalized behaviors which were primarily attributable to the children of lower class migrant and immigrant families. Institutional commitment was a basic tenet of the child-saving philosophy. Delinquents were increasingly committed to institutions on the grounds that their reformation was more likely if they were removed from immoral parents as well as a vicious environment. It is definitely worth noting that the Juvenile Court Act of 1899 did little to change the quality of institutional life for delinquents. In fact, even after the creation of the juvenile court, children continued to be imprisoned with adult criminals in county and city jails. In 1905, the state of Illinois appropriated money to pay for juvenile probation officers, and this marked the beginnings of the decline of the child-saving movement by unpaid volunteers. Also, while Platt does not specifically make this point in his book, it is very possible that after the passage of the 19th Amendment, females had many more opportunities to pursue legitimate careers. They had used the child-saving movement to mobilize and perhaps even achieve political power for themselves. The child-saving movement did also provide new social and professional roles for females. By the 1920s, this movement was passed to paid professionals, some of whom were women. Gault is the landmark U.S. Supreme Court decision that changed the nature of the juvenile justice system. This case held that juveniles accused of crimes in delinquency proceeding must be afforded many of the same due process rights as adults, such as the timely right to have notification of the charges, the right to confront witnesses, the right against self-incrimination, and the right to counsel. The practical result of the Gault case was the introduction of lawyers into the juvenile court. Pages 166 to 171 of Platt's book are definitely worth reading closely. Here, Platt makes many interesting observations about the role that defense attorneys may play in defending juvenile clients. Read these pages closely and keep in mind that when Platt was making this observation, it was only a year or so after the Gault decision. Remember, the Gault decision was in 1967, and the first edition of Platt's book was published in 1969. I think his observations are insightful and quite interesting, especially when one considers the time during which these observations were made. In his final chapter titled Postscript 1977, Anthony Platt revisits the juvenile justice system almost 10 years after initially publishing his book. He argues that in spite of the Gault case, the juvenile justice system has become more repressive and more intrusive into the lives of working-class youth. He also points to various statistics which indicate that the imprisonment of youth increased since the first publication of his book in 1969. And Platt seems leery of the fact that most of the juvenile justice professionals during this time were Caucasian males. He accuses the juvenile justice system of institutional racism and sexism and argues that it has become an instrument of class and racial oppression. Clearly, Platt thought little of the juvenile justice system 10 years after writing his book. And today there are other scholars such as Barry Feld who are strong advocates for dismantling the juvenile justice system altogether. So while Gault definitely formalized the juvenile justice system, there are still many critics. We have spent the beginning of the course examining the history of the juvenile justice system and will now turn to current issues and controversies surrounding this very, very important topic.